The E3 podcast series focuses on various topics around real estate and facilities management. eBiz helps organizations envision the future, enable processes and platforms, and evolve practices for continuous improvement. This episode is What is Embodied Carbon? This is a quick 5-minute overview of what embodied carbon is. It's not a term many are familiar with, so we're going to do a quick explanation. I'm Tracy Jefferson, I'm your host, and I'll be providing the content today. So what is embodied carbon? Embodied carbon is about greenhouse gas emissions related to producing, transporting, and disposing of materials in construction and manufacturing primarily. Sound complicated? Well, it is. We need to take into account CO2 emissions all the way from the very beginning of the process of extracting raw materials, emissions from processing, manufacturing, transportation of materials to like a construction site, activities during construction, recycling efforts, and at some point disposal of the site and materials even related to construction itself. In other words, it impacts the building's entire life cycle. Now for the fun part, how do we calculate the impact? It's challenging for sure. We start with an LCA, a life cycle assessment. We have to identify the different points in the life cycle of a building where there are environmental impacts, which means looking at all stages from obtaining raw materials, any processing, manufacturing processes along the way, the transportation of materials and finished goods, the actual construction itself, how we use a building, and at some point, the end of life. The challenge, of course, in this, data. Data from multiple sources across the value chain, data that's internal, suppliers, manufacturers, transportation firms, construction companies, other stakeholders. And this is where the real complexity lies. Organizations pursuing calculating embodied carbon need to evaluate their own value chain to make sure they're working with firms that track information. If not, it's even more complicated. You know, the other side is there's a lot of marketing and branding value as a supplier, as somebody in that value chain, to be able to say you track emissions, you're tracking things that are going to feed an LCA, and you can provide data. Once you have data, emissions factors need to be applied. If you've chosen participants in your supply chain well, you know, they may be providing data with information they already have in place. There are also standardized emission factors in many cases, but it may be necessary to customize emission factors as well, and that's another challenge. Part of the LCA is determining the scope of this assessment. What parts of a full LCA are applicable to your particular requirements? It's important to define that scope as part of the organization's approach. That way you're consistent in what you're reporting. Another aspect is to establish something called functional units. These are basically location use codes. That way you can do an apples to apples comparisons of buildings. You can't take buildings used for different purposes and look at them the same way. You've got to look at how they're used as part of your overall assessment. And then once all this is in place, you have calculations. Now the calculations that you do need to be for each stage of the building's life cycle. Then you sum them up so you can determine the total impact. You know, it's essential to break down the calculations by stage so that you can compare the performance of the buildings within the different stages, look for areas that you would want to approve at different stages of a construction project in particular. And this allows you to also compare against benchmarks. The final piece of the LCA is something called sensitivity analysis. Here we take into account the uncertainties and variations that are in the data. And this is how we can look for areas of improvement within our process and within data we're gathering as well. What are some types of improvements that reduce the impact of embodied carbon? There's several critical areas. Recycling. Don't just throw things out. Let's look at things that we can recycle and be more efficient there. Look for low carbon alternative materials in your construction. Let's look at how efficient our construction process is. And often this goes back again to our value chain. We've got to look at who's doing things. There are some international standards to be aware of when you're looking at embodied carbon. ISO 14040, ISO 14044, ISO 14045, and ISO 14047 are all detailed requirements for doing an LCA. Now in Europe, there's also something called EN 15978. And this is a European standard similar to ISO 14040 and 14044, but it's a broader set of topics. So this is a good start to the basic fundamental language and what you need to know about embodied carbon. Obviously, there's a lot of details. And if there's any information that we can follow up with, let me know.